The howling wind carried no mercy that night, only ice and darkness. In Coldwater Basin, Nebraska Territory, 1873, a single lantern flickered in the window of a small cabin, its light growing dimmer with each passing hour. Inside, Winifred Aldridge wrapped herself in every quilt she owned, her slender fingers blue-tinged as she held them toward the dying embers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town that had welcomed her with practiced smiles had abandoned her to winter's wrath, leaving the widowed schoolteacher to face the deadly blizzard alone. What they never expected was that fate would send an unlikely guardian, a man the territory feared but never bothered to understand. As the last of Winnie's firewood turned to ash miles away, a lone figure on horseback fought against the storm, drawn by instincts even he couldn't explain. Nebraska Territory had never known such a winter. Old-timers claimed the cold came, straight from the devil's own breath, freezing cattle where they stood and turning brave men into trembling children. 3 weeks of relentless snow had transformed Coldwater Basin from a struggling frontier settlement into a collection of isolated islands, each home a desperate sanctuary against nature's fury. Winifred Aldridge had come to Coldwater Basin 80 months earlier, arriving on the last stage before summer's heat settled across the plains. At 33, she wasn't what the town expected. Too educated for some tastes, too refined for others, with auburn hair always neatly pinned and eyes that revealed an intelligence that made certain men uncomfortable. Her credentials were impeccable, her references stellar, but the gold band she still wore on her left hand told a story she rarely shared aloud. The town needed a teacher. What they got was a woman haunted by memories of Philadelphia drawing rooms and a husband whose body lay somewhere in the blood-soaked fields of Antietam. Captain James Aldridge had been gone 5 years now, but Winnie still found herself turning to share observations with a man who wasn't there. "Mrs. Aldridge, your application is approved, but I must be frank," Obadiah Thornton had told her when she first arrived, his jowled face stern beneath a silver-streaked beard. "Coldwater Basin isn't Philadelphia. Our children need practical learning, not fancy ideas. Can you manage that?" Winnie had smiled demurely, having learned long ago that certain men needed to believe wisdom was their exclusive domain. "I assure you, Mr. Thornton, I can teach your children both sums and Shakespeare. They needn't choose between being practical and being enlightened." Thornton had frowned at that, but the school board was desperate after the previous teacher had fled back east, claiming the Nebraska winter had nearly killed her. What they didn't know was that Winnie wasn't running towards something but away from a family who insisted she remarry, away from sympathetic glances that burned like brands, away from a life where every street corner held the ghost of James. For 7 months, she had taught in the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town, living in the small cabin attached to it, an arrangement that satisfied the town's sense of propriety while providing the solitude she craved. Her students, children of farmers and shopkeepers, initially viewed her with suspicion, but she won them over with stories of places they'd never seen and a genuine interest in their lives that many adults failed to show. By November, she had settled into a careful existence, not quite belonging, but no longer entirely strange. She took her meals alone, attended church services with quiet dignity, and declined the clumsy courtship attempts from widowers eager for someone to mind their children. The only person in town who treated her without either deference or dismissal was Eulalia Winters, an elderly widow who sometimes brought freshly baked bread to the schoolhouse. "You remind me of myself. Before time, and this place wore me down," Eulalia had told her one afternoon. "Be careful, Mrs. Aldridge. Winter comes fierce here, and not everyone in Coldwater has honest intentions." Winnie had nodded politely, assuming the warning referred to unwanted suitors. She hadn't understood that Eulalia meant something far more insidious, the casual cruelty of a community that valued conformity above compassion. December arrived with unusual ferocity. Snow fell for days without ceasing, piling in drifts taller than a man. The temperature plummeted so severely that mercury froze in thermometers. School was suspended indefinitely, and Winnie found herself confined to her cabin, rationing firewood that dwindled faster than she'd anticipated. She wasn't worried at first. Surely someone would check on her, Jeremiah Flint from the general store who always inquired about her reading preferences, or perhaps young Timothy Walsh who delivered mail when the routes were passable. But days passed in silence, broken only by the moaning wind. On the seventh day of the blizzard, Winnie wrapped herself in her heaviest coat and fought her way through snowdrifts to the main street. The effort left her gasping, her lungs burning from exertion and cold. She finally reached Flint's general store, the windows frosted over but a thin curl of smoke, promising warmth inside. The bell chimed weakly as she entered, snow falling from her shoulders. 3 men turned to stare, Jeremiah Flint behind the counter, Obadiah Thornton by the pot-bellied stove, and Millicent Harden's husband Edgar perched on a barrel of flour. "Mrs. Aldridge," Flint acknowledged, his usual friendliness notably absent. "Didn't expect to see anyone out in this weather." Winnie removed her gloves, flexing fingers that had gone numb despite them. "Necessity, Mr. Flint. I'm nearly out of firewood, and my supplies are running dangerously low." A silence followed, heavy with something she couldn't name. Thornton cleared his throat. "Town resources are stretched thin, Mrs. Aldridge. Every family must tend to their own needs just now." "I understand that," Winnie said carefully, "but I'm not asking for charity. I have money to pay for supplies." "Money's no good if there's nothing to buy," Edgar Harden said, not meeting her eyes. "Supplies are reserved for families with children, to feed." The implication struck her like a physical blow. She was not a family. She was a widow, a woman alone, somehow less deserving of survival. "I teach your children," she said quietly, looking between the men. "Does that count for nothing when the schoolroom is closed?" Thornton shifted uncomfortably, but his voice remained firm. "You're not from here, Mrs. Aldridge. You don't understand how things work in times like these. We look after our own first." "And after 8 months, I'm still not one of your own." The words escaped before she could catch them. No one answered. The silence was answer enough. Flint eventually sold her a small bundle of firewood, at twice the usual price, and a meager sack of provisions. It was, she realized as she struggled back through the snow, less an act of kindness than a way to ease their consciences. That night, as she carefully fed twigs into her dying fire, Winnie began a letter she knew might never be sent. To whom it may concern, should this letter reach civilization, I wish to report that the position of schoolteacher in Coldwater Basin, Nebraska Territory, will soon be vacant due to the unfortunate demise of its current occupant. Not from Indians or outlaws, as Eastern papers might sensationally report, but from the calculated indifference of the very community she served. The next morning, she could no longer feel her toes. The fire had died hours ago, and the temperature in the cabin had fallen to match the grave cold outside. Her hands shook too badly to relight the kindling. Through the frosted window, she could just make out the distant smoke rising from chimneys in town, each plume a testament to warmth she had been denied. Winnie thought of James, wondering if this was how he had felt in his final moments, alone, cold, abandoned by those who should have cared. Perhaps there was poetry in such symmetry, though she doubted anyone would remain to write it. As consciousness began to slip away, a strange peace settled over her. The cold no longer hurt. The betrayal no longer stung. She thought she heard Something, a sound that didn't belong to the wind's howl or the cabin's creaking bones, a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps in deep snow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then darkness claimed her. Miles from Coldwater Basin, Nakohe had been tracking a mountain lion that had killed 2 of the army's horses. At 38, he moved with the fluid grace of a younger man, his dark eyes missing nothing as he read. Signs invisible to others. Half Comanche through his mother, half white through a father he'd never known, he existed in the space between worlds, hired for skills the army needed, but ostracized for the heritage they despised. Fort Kearny employed him as a scout, a position that kept him mostly beyond the walls, tracking hostiles, hunting game, and carrying dispatches too dangerous to entrust to regular couriers. He preferred it that way. The fort's confines felt like a prison, the stares of soldiers and their families, a constant reminder that he belonged nowhere. The blizzard had caught him returning from a 2-week reconnaissance mission. A wiser man would have sought shelter immediately, but Nakohe pushed on, following an internal compass more reliable than any the army issued. He had nearly reached the fort when he felt a pull toward the east, a sensation he had learned never to ignore. His sorrel mare protested as he changed direction, heading toward Coldwater Basin through deepening snow. He had visited the settlement only twice before, both times met with suspicion bordering on hostility. The town had a reputation for being particularly unwelcoming to Indians or mixed bloods, which made his compulsion to ride there all the more puzzling. The journey took hours, visibility reduced to mere feet ahead. When the dark shape of the schoolhouse finally emerged through the swirling white, Nakohe paused, listening. Something had drawn him here, something beyond reason or explanation. He dismounted, tethering his mare beneath the schoolhouse overhang where she would have some protection from the wind. The cabin attached to the school showed no signs of life. No smoke, no light, no movement. Still, he approached, instinct guiding him where logic suggested nothing waited but an empty building. He knocked, receiving no answer. The door wasn't locked, which struck him as odd. When he pushed it open, the wave of cold air that greeted him told him everything. The woman lay crumpled near a cold hearth, her skin pallid with a bluish tinge that spoke of imminent death. He knew immediately who she was. The Eastern schoolteacher the soldiers sometimes mentioned, usually with remarks about her refined manner or how out of place she seemed on the frontier. Nakohe didn't hesitate. He gathered her limp form in, his arms, her weight alarmingly slight, and carried her outside to his horse. With practiced efficiency, he wrapped her in his buffalo hide and secured her before him on the saddle. The town of Coldwater Basin lay just a quarter-mile away, chimneys smoking with the promise of warmth, but he turned his horse in the opposite direction. Whatever had befallen this woman, he suspected the town was responsible, either through action or inaction. He knew of a place, a line shack used by cattle drivers during the summer months, abandoned now but stocked with basic supplies. It would have to do. The woman stirred only once during the long ride, her eyes opening briefly, unfocused and clouded with confusion. "James," she whispered, before slipping back into unconsciousness. "Not James," Nakohe replied to ears that couldn't hear him. "But I'll get you somewhere safe." Blackfeather Hollow appeared as darkness fell, a crude but solid structure nestled against a ridge that provided natural shelter from the northern wind. Nakohe dismounted carefully, keeping the woman wrapped as he carried her inside. The interior was simple. A small stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, a narrow cot, and shelves containing provisions left for travelers caught in weather precisely like this. It took him less than 15 minutes to build a fire that roared. With welcome heat, he placed the still unconscious woman on the cot, checking her breathing and pulse. Both were present but dangerously weak. Her extremities showed early signs of frostbite, not severe enough to guarantee loss of fingers or toes, but concerning nonetheless. As the cabin slowly warmed, Nakohe melted snow for water and searched the provisions for anything that might help. He found jerky, beans, coffee, and, surprisingly, a small medical kit containing bandages and a bottle of whiskey. The latter would serve dual purposes tonight. When he turned back to the cot, he found her awake, staring at him with eyes that held more confusion than fear. "You're safe," he said simply, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her. "This is a line shack in Blackfeather Hollow. You were freezing to death." She attempted to sit up, then gasped as pain flooded her thawing limbs. "You found me." Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. He nodded, pouring a cup of water and approaching. "Slowly, drink this, slowly." She accepted the cup with trembling hands, studying him over its rim. Recognition gradually dawned in her eyes. "You're the scout from Fort Kearney. I've seen you ride past the schoolhouse." "Nakohe," he offered, surprising himself. He rarely gave his name to strangers, preferring the anonymity of scout or the more derogatory terms people typically used. "Winifred Aldridge," she replied formally, as though they were being introduced at a social gathering rather than in a crude shelter during a blizzard. "Most call me Winnie." "You were alone," he observed, the question implicit. Her gaze dropped to the cup in her hands. "Yes." "The town decided I wasn't worth the firewood," she said with a bitter smile that looked out of place on her refined features. Nakohe nodded, understanding completely. He had seen similar callousness in settlements across the territory. People who preached Christian charity on Sundays and practiced selective humanity the rest of the week. "Your feet and hands need attention," he said, indicating the whiskey and bandages he had set aside. "The frostbite isn't severe, but it will be painful as feeling returns." She glanced at her blue-tinged fingers and nodded with surprising composure. "Do what you must, Mr. Nakohe." "Just Nakohe," he corrected, kneeling to remove her boots with careful movements. "No, mister." As he worked, bathing her feet in lukewarm water and gradually increasing the temperature, he expected her to flinch at his touch or express discomfort at being tended by a half-Comanche stranger. Instead, she watched him with clear eyes, occasionally biting her lip against the pain but offering no complaint. "You've done this before," she observed. "2 winters with the 10th Cavalry," he replied. "Frostbite was common." "The Buffalo Soldiers?" she asked, surprising him with her knowledge of the all-black regiment. He nodded, wrapping her feet in clean bandages. "They treated me better than most. Understood what it meant to be seen as less than human." The words hung in the air between them, more than he had intended to reveal. Winnie held his gaze for a long moment, then said softly, "Thank you for finding me, Nakohe. I believe you saved my life tonight." He turned away, uncomfortable with gratitude. "The storm won't break for days. We're trapped here until it does." "I understand," she said, and he believed she did. Understood not just their immediate circumstance, but the larger reality that had brought them to this moment. 2 outsiders finding brief sanctuary in a world that had no place for either of them. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal. Inside, an unlikely fire burned against the darkness, and 2 strangers began the careful process of trusting what neither fully understood. The first night passed in wakeful silence. Nakohe insisted Winnie take the cot while he sat by the fire, feeding it regularly to maintain the warmth her body desperately needed. She drifted between consciousness and fevered dreams, occasionally calling out for James in a voice that made the scout look away, recognizing grief that wasn't meant for him to witness. By morning, the worst of the danger had passed. Color returned to Winnie's face, and though her hands and feet throbbed with pain, the frostbite had not advanced to the blackened stage that would have meant amputation. She managed to sit up and accept the coffee Nakohe offered, black and bitter, but wonderfully warm. "The blizzard?" she asked, looking toward the single window, frosted over with ice. "Still raging," he replied. "We have provisions for a week if we're careful. The storm may break before then." She nodded, cradling the tin cup between bandaged hands. "They won't look for me," she said after a moment. "The town, I mean." "I know." The simple acknowledgement held no pity, for which she was grateful. The last thing she wanted was compassion born of superiority, the kind that had followed her after James's death, when Philadelphia society had viewed her as a broken thing to be pitied and eventually repaired through a suitable remarriage. "May I ask you something?" she ventured, watching as Nakohe checked his rifle, an old Sharps that had seen better days. He glanced up, dark eyes unreadable. "You may ask. How did you find me? Why were you even near the schoolhouse in such weather?" His hands stilled on the rifle. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "I was returning to the fort. Something pulled me toward the schoolhouse instead." "Something?" He shrugged slightly. "My mother's people believe in signs, in the breath of spirits that guide those who listen. My father's people call it providence or God's will." A faint smile touched his lips. "The army calls it dumb luck." "And what do you call it?" Winnie asked. Nakohe considered her question seriously. "I call it knowing when something is wrong in the world and being willing to follow that knowing, even when it makes no sense." She accepted this with a thoughtful nod. "My husband used to say something similar about battlefield instincts, that sometimes your mind knows things your thoughts haven't caught up to yet." It was the first time she had mentioned James directly, and Nakohe noted the past tense with a questioning look. "Antietam," she said simply. "He was a captain in the Union Army. They never recovered his body." Nakohe nodded once, understanding the weight of such a loss. "I was a tracker for the Union during the last year of the war," he offered, "scouting behind Confederate lines in Arkansas." This revelation surprised her. "Did you enlist?" A short, humorless laugh escaped him. "No, I was given the choice between prison for a crime I didn't commit or volunteering my services. The Army discovered I could read terrain better than their maps could. And after the war? After the war, they discovered I was still useful but remembered I was still half savage." The bitterness in his voice was controlled, but unmistakable. Winnie studied him openly now, the angular features that spoke of his Comanche heritage, the way he moved with deliberate economy, the watchfulness in eyes that had seen too much to trust easily. "Yet you continue to work for them," she observed. "I continue to survive," he corrected. "There are limited options for a man like me." The honesty between them was unexpected, formed perhaps by the intimacy of shared danger and isolation. Two strangers who had little reason to trust anyone, yet circumstances had stripped away the usual barriers of propriety and prejudice. As the day progressed, Winnie's strength gradually returned. She insisted on helping prepare their meager meal of beans and jerky, moving carefully around the small cabin, despite Nakohe's objections. Activity felt better than the helplessness of lying still, with nothing but painful memories for company. "Tell me about your students," Nakohe said unexpectedly as they ate. The question brightened her expression immediately. 23 children, ages 6 to 16. Most have never been beyond Coldwater Basin, but they're curious about everything. Elizabeth Harmon wants to be a doctor, though her father says it's nonsense. Thomas Reed has a mind for mathematics that could take him to any university in the country if someone would only nurture it. "You care for them," he observed. "Of course, they're children. Their possibilities are endless if given the chance." She paused, her enthusiasm dimming. "Though after this, I don't know if I can return to teach them." "Because of their parents?" She nodded slowly. How do you face children knowing their families left you to freeze? How do you teach about moral character when—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Children are not their parents," Nakohe said with quiet certainty. "They can learn different ways if shown them." "Is that what you believe? That people can change?" He considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Some can. Those who question what they've been taught, those who look with their own eyes instead of borrowing the sight of others." He met her gaze directly. "You saw me differently than most white women would. I saw someone who saved my life," she countered. "After you had already seen me as human," he replied. "Before the rescue. I noticed when I would ride past the schoolhouse. You nodded to me. Others turn away or stare as though I'm an exhibit." Winnie hadn't realized he had noticed those brief encounters. "My husband commanded black soldiers in a war where both sides considered them inferior. He believed character transcended race or birth. I came to share that belief. Your husband sounds like an unusual man." "He was," she said softly. After a moment she added, "Coldwater Basin would consider this highly improper, you know. A woman alone with a man, not her husband." Nakohe's mouth curved in a smile that transformed his stern features. "I believe freezing to death would be considered more improper." Unexpectedly, Winnie laughed, a sound she had almost forgotten she could make. A fair point. As darkness fell and the wind continued its assault on their shelter, they settled into an almost comfortable routine. Nakohe maintained the fire and checked the stability of the roof, where snow accumulated heavily. Winnie organized their remaining provisions and discovered a shelf of battered books left by previous occupants, mostly dime novels and a farmer's almanac, but also, surprisingly, a volume of Tennyson's poetry. "Would you like me to read aloud?" she asked, holding up the book. "It might pass the time." Nakohe hesitated, then nodded. "I would," he admitted. And so, by firelight in a crude shelter while winter raged outside, the schoolteacher's voice gave life to words of beauty and longing. Nakohe listened intently, occasionally closing his eyes to better absorb the cadence and imagery. When she paused, he would sometimes ask her to explain a reference or repeat a particularly striking line. It was during one such moment, after she had read Ulysses with its defiant call to embrace life's adventures, that he asked, "Did you teach this to your students?" "Some of it," she replied. "The younger ones prefer simpler verses, but the older children connect with the emotions, even if they don't understand every word. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield," he quoted, surprising her with his perfect recall of the poem's final line. "You have a remarkable memory." He shrugged slightly. "My people's traditions were passed through spoken word, not written. Memory was essential." After a moment's hesitation, he added, "I could teach you some Comanche words, if you'd like." The offer clearly meant more than the casual way he presented it. Winnie recognized it as a gift, a sharing of something personal and precious. "I would be honored," she said sincerely. And so their unlikely education began. He taught her basic greetings, the names of animals, and words for weather and landscape. She was a quick study, her ear attuned to the unfamiliar sounds, her pronunciation improving with each attempt. In return, she shared stories of Philadelphia, of museums and libraries he had never seen, describing paintings and sculptures so vividly he could almost visualize them. Neither mentioned what would happen when the storm finally broke, when they would return to a world where such conversations between them would be unthinkable. For now, they existed in a suspended moment where normal rules had no meaning, where two souls recognized something in each other that transcended society's narrow definitions. On the third day, as Winnie stood by the window watching snow swirl in hypnotic patterns, She asked the question that had been building since her rescue. "What will you tell them at the fort about finding me?" Nikohi looked up from where he was repairing a tear in his buckskin jacket. "The truth, that I found the schoolteacher near death and brought her to safety." "They won't misunderstand?" His expression hardened slightly. "They always misunderstand. It doesn't matter what actually happened." She turned fully to face him. "It matters to me." Something shifted in his eyes then, a recognition of what she was truly asking. Would he protect not just her life, but her reputation, her future in a society that would condemn her for circumstances beyond her control? "I will say only what needs to be said," he assured her. "That I found you unconscious, that medical attention was required, that the nearest shelter was this line shack, all of which is true." Winnie nodded, relieved but also strangely sad. The necessity of such careful truths highlighted the world they would soon return to, a world where their brief connection would become something to hide rather than cherish. "And Coldwater Basin?" she asked. "What should I tell them?" Nakohe's gaze was steady. "Tell them whatever will keep you safe. If that means gratitude to invisible rescuers, so be it." "I won't lie about who saved me," she said firmly. "Then be prepared for the consequences." She squared her shoulders, a familiar determination settling over her features. "I've faced consequences before. When I insisted on teaching Black history to children in Philadelphia. When I refused suitors my family deemed appropriate. When I came west against everyone's advice." She smiled faintly. "I'm more resilient than I appear, Nakohe." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded with newfound respect. "I believe you are, Winifred Aldridge." That evening, as they shared what remained of their coffee, Nakohe revealed something he had kept private until... "Now, I'm leaving Fort Kearney," he said quietly. "I've received orders to transfer to Fort Sill in Indian Territory. They need scouts familiar with Comanche ways." The news shouldn't have affected her as it did. After all, once they returned to civilization, their paths would naturally diverge. Yet something tightened in her chest at the thought of him riding south, disappearing from her life as suddenly as he had entered it. "When do you leave?" she managed to ask. "As soon as I return. The papers are already signed." Winnie nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "It sounds like an opportunity to be where your skills are truly valued." He gave her a look that suggested he saw through her forced optimism. "It's a posting no white scout would accept. Comanche territory is considered a death sentence. Is it, for you?" His smile held no humor. "My mother's people would kill me for the white blood in my veins. The army would abandon me the moment I became inconvenient. It's not an opportunity, Winnie. It's an exile." The use of her informal name, the first time he had spoken it, emphasized the gravity of his confession. This wasn't idle conversation, but a truth he had shared with no one else. "Then don't go," she said impulsively. "Surely there are other options." "Such as?" The challenge in his voice made her hesitate. What could she possibly suggest that he hadn't already considered and dismissed? What future could exist for a man the world had categorized so narrowly? Before she could respond, a new sound cut through the constant howl of the wind. A sharp crack from above that made both of them look up in alarm. A second crack followed, louder than the first, and then a groaning noise that raised the hair on Winnie's arms. "The roof," Nakohe said tersely, immediately moving toward her. "Too much snow. Get to the door." He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the entrance, just as a third crack split the air like a gunshot. Winnie barely had time to register what was happening before Nakohe shoved her through the doorway and into the blinding snow outside. She stumbled, falling to her knees as a thunderous crash shook the ground behind her. Turning, she watched. in horror as half the cabin's roof collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, sending a plume of debris and white powder into the air. Nakohe had been directly behind her. Now he was nowhere to be seen. "Nakohe!" she screamed, fighting her way back toward the partially collapsed structure. "Nakohe!" No answer came from the ruins. Panic seized Winnie's chest as she clawed through the snow toward the partially collapsed structure. Her bandaged hands burned with pain, but she barely noticed as she called Nakohe's name again and again. The wind swallowed her voice, carrying it away across the endless white landscape. Time seemed to stretch and contract simultaneously. She had no idea how long she'd been digging when her fingers struck something solid, a piece of the fallen timber. She redoubled her efforts, shoving aside splintered wood and packed snow until she uncovered a hand, then an arm. "Please," she whispered, the words somewhere between prayer and command. "Please be alive." She uncovered his face, brushing away snow with trembling fingers. A gash across his forehead leaked blood that looked black in the dim light, but his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by renewed urgency. She needed to get him out before the rest of the roof gave way, or the cold claimed them both. Winnie had never considered herself physically strong. Society had taught her that feminine delicacy was a virtue, that exertion was unseemly for a lady. But as she dragged Nakohe's unconscious form from the wreckage, she discovered strength she never knew she possessed. Perhaps it had always been there, waiting for necessity to call it forth. The intact portion of the cabin offered minimal shelter. One corner where the roof still held and the fireplace still stood. Winnie managed to drag Nakohe into this refuge, propping him against the wall furthest from the collapsed section. The fire had been extinguished by falling debris, and the temperature dropped precipitously with each passing minute. She needed to revive the flames, but everything was wet from snow or scattered beyond reach. Desperation made her resourceful. She tore strips from her petticoat, then searched the ruins until she found the medical kit with its precious bottle of whiskey. Soaking the fabric in alcohol and placing it among the least damaged kindling, she used Nakohe's flint and steel to create sparks. Her first 3 attempts failed, the sparks dying before catching. On the 4th try, a tiny flame appeared, wavering uncertainly before taking hold. Winnie fed it carefully, adding splinters from broken furniture until the fire burned steadily enough to risk larger pieces of wood. Only when warmth began to return did she turn her attention to Nakohe's injuries. The head wound looked worse than it was, a surface laceration rather than a fracture. More concerning was his right arm, which lay at an unnatural angle that suggested a broken bone. His breathing remained shallow but steady, giving her hope that no internal injuries threatened his life. She cleaned the head wound with melted snow and a scrap of relatively clean fabric, then bound it as best she could. For his arm, she remembered James describing how field medics set broken bones during battle. It would cause immense pain, but leaving it untreated wasn't an option. Winnie gathered what she needed: 2 relatively straight pieces of wood for splints, strips of fabric for binding, and the whiskey for both disinfection and dulling pain. She was about to begin when Nakohe's eyes fluttered open, disoriented, and clouded with pain. "Don't move," she said firmly, placing a hand on his chest to prevent him from rising. "The roof collapsed. You're hurt." He blinked slowly, awareness returning in stages. "You're all right?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Thanks to you," she replied. "You pushed me clear before it fell." He tried to shift and immediately grimaced, his gaze falling to his misaligned arm. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "It needs setting." "I know. I was about to try, but you'll need to pull it straight," he interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact despite the pain evident in his features. "Hard and fast, then bind it between the splints." Winnie swallowed. Hard, suddenly uncertain. Theory was one thing. Actually, manipulating a broken bone was another entirely. I've never done this before. I have, he said grimly, but not on myself. He reached for the whiskey bottle with his good hand. This will help. He took a long drink, then another, before handing it back to her. Pour some over your hands first. She did as instructed, the alcohol stinging the raw spots where her bandages had come loose during her frantic digging. Nakohe positioned himself with his back against the wall for support and extended his injured arm with a stoicism that belied the agony such movement must have caused. Count to 3, he said, meeting her eyes steadily. Then pull and twist in one motion. Don't hesitate even if I react. Winnie nodded, grasping his wrist with one hand and his elbow with the other. She began counting, her voice surprisingly even. 1, 2. She pulled on 2, reasoning that anticipation would only make the pain worse. The bone made a sickening sound as it realigned. Nakohe's entire body went rigid, a strangled noise escaping through clenched teeth before his head fell back against the wall, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Winnie worked quickly, positioning the splints and binding the arm securely before he regained full awareness. By the time she finished, his breathing had steadied, though his face remained ashen beneath its natural bronze hue. You miscounted, he observed after a long silence. I did, she admitted, not apologizing. It seemed kinder. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was. They regarded each other for a moment, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition of shared resilience, of trust forged in extremity. Then Winnie rose to assess their situation, acutely aware that their survival now depended on her. The reality was grim. Nearly half their supplies lay buried beneath snow and timber. The partial roof would not last through another heavy snowfall. The temperature continued to drop as night approached. They needed more substantial shelter, and soon. We have to leave, she announced, returning to where Nakohe sat. He glanced toward the collapsed section, then at the darkening sky visible through the breach. The storm hasn't broken. It's lessened enough to travel a short distance, she countered. You mentioned Fort Kearney is less than a day's ride from here. We won't make it that far, but there must be somewhere closer. Nakohe considered this, clearly weighing their limited options. There's a cave system about 3 miles east. Difficult to find unless you know it's there. I've used it before. Can you ride? His mouth twisted in what might have been appreciation for her directness. I'll manage. They salvaged what they could, the remaining food, the medical supplies, what dried clothing they found, and the precious volume of Tennyson that had somehow survived unscathed. Nako's mare had sheltered beneath an overhang during the collapse and stood nervously as they approached, sensing her master's injury. Mounting was an ordeal that left Nakohe pale and sweating despite the bitter cold. Winnie climbed up behind him, her arms encircling his waist to both support him and maintain her own balance. The proximity would have scandalized proper society, but such concerns seemed laughably irrelevant now. They rode into deepening twilight, the wind mercifully at their backs. Nakohe directed them with occasional murmured instructions, his body gradually leaning more heavily against Winnie as weakness overtook determination. She found herself taking the reins from his failing grip, guiding the horse according to his increasingly sporadic directions. There, he finally said, indicating a rocky outcropping nearly invisible in the gathering darkness. Behind those stones. Winnie would have ridden past without noticing the narrow opening, partially concealed by wind-sculpted snowdrifts. She dismounted first, then helped Nakohe down, supporting much of his weight as they made their way inside. The entrance widened into a natural chamber that, while not large, offered complete protection from the elements. Most importantly, the cave retained heat. As soon as they moved beyond the entrance, the brutal wind disappeared, replaced by stillness that felt almost warm by comparison. Nakohe slumped against the stone wall, exhaustion finally claiming the last of his reserves. "We'll need a fire," he managed, his voice fading. "Wood outside. Previous visits." His eyes closed, leaving Winnie to search on her own. She found a small cache of firewood stacked against an inner wall, old and dry, but still burnable. Starting a fire took less time now that she had proper materials, and soon a modest blaze illuminated the cave, revealing smooth walls marked with ancient pictographs. She helped Nakohe closer to the warmth, making a pallet from the buffalo, hide and their coats. His skin burned with unnatural heat when she checked his forehead, suggesting the onset of fever. The head wound likely wasn't the cause. Exposure and trauma seemed more probable culprits. Through the night, she maintained the fire and bathed his face with cool water melted from snow carried inside. He drifted between consciousness and delirious dreams, sometimes speaking in Comanche, other times calling out orders as though back on a battlefield. During one lucid moment, he grasped her wrist with surprising strength. "Why didn't you leave me?" he asked, his gaze intense despite the fever. "You could have made it to the fort." The question startled her. "Leave you? After you saved my life?" "Many would have," he said simply. "A white woman alone, an injured half-breed. They would understand your choice." "Then they don't understand me at all," she replied, with unexpected fierceness. "I would never abandon someone who needed help, regardless of who they are." He studied her face as though searching for deception, then nodded slightly. "No," he agreed softly. "You wouldn't." His eyes closed again, but his expression had eased. Winnie stayed awake until exhaustion claimed her near dawn. She woke hours later to find Nakohe sitting up, his fever broken, examining the cave walls with interest. "The pictographs," he explained, noting her questioning look. "They're very old. My mother's people wouldn't have made these." Winnie studied. The red ochre drawings, stylized animals, human figures, spiraling symbols whose meanings had been lost to time. Who then? Someone who passed through long ago, before Europeans, before horses came to the plains. His gaze traveled across the wall thoughtfully. Whoever they were, they sheltered here just as we do now. They recorded their journey, their hunt, their vision. There was something poignant in his observation, the continuity of human experience across centuries, the shared need for safety, and the impulse to leave a mark saying, "I was here." Winnie wondered if anyone would remember their story generations, hence, or if it would fade like footprints in snow. "How are you feeling?" she asked, changing the subject. "Better," he acknowledged. "The arm will take weeks to heal properly, but the fever has passed." He glanced toward the cave entrance, where daylight gleamed on snow. The storm has finally broken. The implications hung between them, unspoken but unavoidable. With clear weather came the expectation of return, to Fort Kearny, to Coldwater Basin, to the separate paths their lives should follow according to every social convention. "We should wait another day," Winnie suggested, not quite meeting his eyes. "To ensure your strength returns before traveling." Nakohe said nothing, but she sensed his unspoken agreement. Neither was eager to relinquish this strange sanctuary, where rank, race, and propriety had no meaning. Here, they were simply two people who had faced death together and emerged with a connection that defied easy categorization. They passed the day in quiet conversation. Nakohe told her about his mother, a Comanche woman who had been captured during a raid, then later refused to return to her tribe after giving birth to a mixed-blood son. She had taught him the old ways despite living among whites, ensuring he understood his heritage, even as she encouraged him to navigate the white man's world. "She died when I was 15, he said, adding another branch to the fire. "Consumption. The army doctor refused to treat an Indian woman. Winnie thought of her own mother, still alive in Philadelphia, writing letters filled with gossip and gentle pressure to return east. Two women with nothing in common save the fierce protection of their children, one through presence, one through absence. "What about your father?" she asked. "A cavalry officer. He acknowledged me, which was more than most would have done. But he had a wife and legitimate children back east." Nakohe's tone held no bitterness, merely statement of fact. "He arranged my first position as a scout when I was 17. It was a kindness, I suppose. In return, Winnie shared stories of her life with James, their courtship during the early days of the war, their brief marriage before he marched south with his regiment, the 3 years of letters that sustained her until the final telegram arrived with its terse notification of his death. "The hardest part wasn't losing him," she confessed. "It was losing the future we had planned, the children we would have, the places we would see, the life we would build after the fighting ended." She traced patterns in the dust beside her. "For a long time, I felt I'd lost my own future, not just his." "And now?" Nakohe asked quietly. She considered the question with genuine reflection. "Now I'm not certain what my future holds. Teaching has given me purpose, but Coldwater Basin..." She trailed off, unable to imagine returning to a community that had left her to die. "You don't have to go back there," he pointed out. "Where, then? Every frontier town needs teachers, but they all share similar prejudices. Eastern cities have their own rigid expectations for widows." She smiled ruefully. "I seem to fit nowhere comfortably." "I understand that feeling," he said, the understatement drawing a soft laugh from her despite the seriousness of their conversation. As evening approached, Winnie read aloud from the Tennyson volume again, this time selecting In Memoriam, the poet's extended reflection on grief and healing after loss. The words echoed against ancient stone, lending them additional weight and resonance. "I hold it true whate'er befall, I feel it when I sorrow most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all," she read, her voice softening on the familiar lines. "Do you believe that?" Nakohe asked when she finished. Winnie closed the book, considering. "I think I do, yes. Despite everything, I wouldn't trade the time I had with James, even knowing how it would end." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "What about you? Have you ever loved someone that way?" The question was boldly personal, crossing boundaries she would never have approached in normal circumstances. But nothing about their situation was normal, and conventional restraints seemed increasingly irrelevant. Nakohe was silent so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice held an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Once," he admitted, "a Cheyenne woman named Mourning Dove. We planned to marry, to find a place away from both armies, and agencies where we could live on our own terms." His expression darkened. "Her family refused to allow her to marry a half-blood. They sent her to relatives in the north. I never saw her again." "I'm sorry," Winnie said softly. He nodded acknowledgement. "It was 10 years ago. The pain fades, as you know, but never completely disappears," she added, understanding perfectly. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared loss, of opportunities foreclosed by circumstances beyond their control. Neither acknowledged it aloud, but both felt the subtle realignment of their relationship from rescuer and rescued to something more balanced, more equal in its vulnerability. They slept that night on opposite sides of the fire, yet somehow closer than before. Morning brought clear skies and the unavoidable reality that they must leave their sanctuary. They packed silently, each lost in private thoughts about what awaited them beyond the cave's protection. The mare seemed eager to depart, perhaps sensing her rider's improved condition or simply restless after confinement. Nakohe could mount, without assistance now, though his splintered arm remained securely bound against his chest. Winnie climbed up behind him, maintaining a slight distance rather than pressing close as necessity had previously required. The change felt significant somehow, an acknowledgement that their return to civilization demanded resumed propriety. They rode west toward Fort Kearny, following a route that would bypass Coldwater Basin entirely. Neither mentioned the town, though its presence lay between them like a shadow. The journey took most of the day, the horse moving carefully through snow that sometimes reached its chest in deeper drifts. As the fort's walls appeared on the horizon, Winnie felt an inexplicable reluctance growing with each hoofbeat. Return meant safety, shelter, proper medical attention for Nakohe, all things they desperately needed. Yet it also meant separation, a severing of the connection they had formed, a return to lives where someone like her did not associate with someone like him. "What will you tell them?" she asked, unconsciously echoing his earlier question to her. He understood immediately. "The truth. That I found you near death, that we sought shelter during the storm, that we survived the collapse and found secondary refuge." After a pause, he added, "Nothing more." She nodded, grateful for his discretion yet oddly disappointed by it, as though their shared experience deserved fuller acknowledgement than the sanitized version propriety demanded. The fort sentry spotted them when they were still half a mile out. By the time they reached the gates, a small, welcoming party had assembled. 2 officers, the fort's doctor, and several enlisted men. Their expressions registered shock at the sight of Winnie behind Nakohe on the horse, though military discipline kept most comments unspoken. "Scout Nakohe reporting," he said formally as they halted. "I've brought Mrs. Aldridge, the schoolteacher. From Coldwater Basin, she requires medical attention for frostbite and exposure." Major Ellis, the fort's second-in-command, stepped forward. "Mrs. Aldridge, we had no idea you were in distress. When did you leave town?" The implied assumption that she had deliberately set out during a blizzard sparked indignation that Winnie struggled to conceal. "I didn't leave, Major. The town left me without adequate supplies or firewood during the storm. Scout Nakohe found me unconscious in my cabin and saved my life." A ripple of murmurs passed through the assembled men. Ellis looked distinctly uncomfortable. "I see. Well, you're safe now. Dr. Patterson will tend to you both." He glanced at Nakohe's splinted arm with what might have been genuine concern. "That looks serious, Scout." "Broken during a shelter collapse," Nakohe replied neutrally. "Mrs. Aldridge set and splintered it." This revelation earned Winnie several reassessing looks from the soldiers. Women were expected to faint at the sight of blood, not set, broken bones. Dr. Patterson, a balding man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression, helped her dismount with careful hands. "Let's get you both inside," he said, his tone professionally brisk. "You'll need thorough examinations, proper bandaging, and warm beds." Winnie glanced back as they led her toward the infirmary. Nakohe remained mounted, his expression unreadable as he observed her departure. Something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was already distancing himself, returning to the reserved scout who existed on civilization's margins. The man, who had shared poetry and memories in a firelit cave, seemed to vanish before her eyes. The following days passed in a blur of recovery and unexpected attention. Word of Winnie's ordeal spread quickly through the fort and surrounding homesteads. The officers' wives visited with concerned clucks and offers of clothing to replace what she'd lost. The fort's commander, Colonel Brennan, assured her she could remain as long as necessary while deciding her next steps. No one mentioned Nakohe directly, though his role in her rescue was acknowledged in passing. She learned he was recovering in separate quarters near the stables, typical accommodation for scouts and trackers, rather than the infirmary where she stayed. The division seemed emblematic of everything that separated them, now that they had returned to ordered society. On her third day at the fort, a delegation arrived from Coldwater Basin: Obadiah Thornton, Jeremiah Flint, and Millicent Harden. Their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and defensive posturing. Winnie received them in the officers' dining room, where she had been invited to take her meals during convalescence. "Mrs. Aldridge," Thornton began without preamble, "we've come to escort you back to town. Your position remains open, and the school board wishes you to resume teaching as soon as you're able." The audacity of the assumption that she would simply return as though nothing had happened left her momentarily speechless. Flint mistook her silence for hesitation and added hastily, "Your cabin has been fully stocked with supplies, and we've arranged for regular firewood deliveries." His tone suggested she should be grateful for this belated consideration. Millicent Harden nodded vigorously. "The children miss you terribly. They need their teacher." Winnie regarded them steadily, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "You left me to freeze to death." The blunt statement hung in the air between them. Thornton shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Mrs. Aldridge, that's an exaggeration. Times were difficult during the worst of the storm, and resources were stretched thin. For everyone. Yet no one else nearly died from cold in their own home," she observed. "Curious, isn't it?" "We didn't know your situation was so dire," Flint protested weakly. "You didn't want to know," she corrected, "just as you don't want to acknowledge that my rescue came at the hands of a man your town would never allow through its doors." Millicent's expression soured at the mention of Nakohe, though she didn't speak his name. Well, that was fortunate timing, of course. Providence works in mysterious ways. "Providence," Winnie repeated, the word sharp with irony. "Is that what we're calling it? Not basic human decency? Not courage and compassion from someone you would cross the street to avoid?" Thornton's face hardened. "I see your ordeal has left you somewhat distraught, Mrs. Aldridge. Perhaps you need more time to recover before making decisions about your future." "I'm perfectly clear-headed," she assured him. "Clear enough to recognize that I cannot return to teach in a community that selectively applies Christian principles depending on who needs help. The children shouldn't suffer for adult concerns," Millicent argued, playing what she clearly considered her strongest card. Winnie felt a pang at the thought of her students. Innocent. Participants in their parents' moral failures. "No, they shouldn't," she agreed, "which is why I'll fulfill my contract until the end of the school term in May." She held up a hand to forestall their relieved expressions. "But I will do so while residing here at the fort and traveling daily to the schoolhouse. I will not live in Coldwater Basin again." The delegation exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for this compromise. Thornton recovered first. "That's highly irregular, Mrs. Aldridge. The teacher is expected to live on school property." "So is the teacher expected to survive winter," she countered smoothly. "Expectations, it seems, are negotiable in Coldwater Basin. These are my terms. Accept them, or find another teacher willing to risk their life for your children's education." The bluntness of her ultimatum clearly shocked them. Women of her background, educated, refined Eastern, were expected to couch their opinions in gentle suggestions, not direct challenges. The Winifred Aldridge, who had arrived in Nebraska Territory 8 months ago, might have done so. The woman, who had survived abandonment, rescue, and a collapsing shelter, had no patience left for such niceties. After a considerable silence, Thornton nodded stiffly. "Very well. We accept your terms for the remainder of the school year. A wagon will transport you to and from the schoolhouse daily." He paused, then added with transparent insincerity, "The town council extends its deepest apologies for any misunderstanding that may have occurred during the storm." "Noted," Winnie replied, not bothering to disguise her skepticism. "Classes will resume next Monday, weather permitting." When they had gone, she remained seated at the dining table, turning a teacup between her hands. The victory felt hollow somehow, tainted by compromise and the knowledge that nothing had really changed in Coldwater Basin. They would tolerate her terms because they needed a teacher, not because they recognized their moral failure or her right to safety. She had not seen Nakohe since their arrival at the fort. Dr. Patterson provided updates on his recovery when she inquired, but always with a slight frown that suggested such interest was inappropriate. The fort maintained its invisible but rigid barriers. Officers and their families in one sphere, enlisted men in another, and scouts, trackers, and other auxiliaries in yet another, separate and unequal. That evening, she walked to the edge of the parade ground, ostensibly for fresh air, but actually hoping to glimpse the quarters where Nakohe stayed. A young lieutenant hurried to accompany her, offering his arm against non-existent unsteadiness, and making well-meaning but condescending conversation about her harrowing adventure. It must have been terribly frightening, he observed, being alone with with someone of mixed heritage. Winnie stopped walking, causing the lieutenant to halt mid-step in surprise. "His name is Nakohe," she said evenly. "And no, Lieutenant, it wasn't frightening at all. It was the safest I've felt since arriving in this territory." The young officer blinked, clearly unsure how to respond to such a direct contradiction of his assumptions. "Well, yes, I'm sure he's very good at his job. The Army only employs the best scouts, of course." "He's more than his job," she replied, knowing she was crossing boundaries but unable to stop herself. "He's a man of intelligence, honor, and remarkable resilience despite how this world has treated him. I owe him my life, and I've not even been permitted to thank him properly since arriving here." The lieutenant looked profoundly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Aldridge, it's not customary for ladies to associate with—" "I'm aware of the customs, Lieutenant," she interrupted. "I find them lacking in basic humanity." Before he could formulate a response, she spotted a familiar figure crossing the far side of the parade ground, Nakohe, his arms still in a sling, but otherwise moving with his characteristic fluid grace. Without thinking, she called his name. He turned instantly, identifying her even at a distance. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, glancing at the lieutenant beside her. Then, with deliberate steps, he approached, stopping at a respectful distance and nodding acknowledgement. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said formally, "I'm pleased to see you recovering well." "Thanks to your care," she replied, ignoring the lieutenant's poorly concealed discomfort. "How is your arm healing?" "Adequately," he answered, his tone neutral though. His eyes conveyed more complex emotions. "The doctor believes it will mend completely with time." "I'm glad to hear it." She hesitated, then added impulsively, "I've arranged to continue teaching in Coldwater Basin while residing here at the fort. I'll remain until May at least." Something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps satisfaction, before disappearing behind his careful mask. "A sensible arrangement." The lieutenant cleared his throat pointedly. "Mrs. Aldridge, we should return to the infirmary. Dr. Patterson advised against overexertion." Winnie ignored him, keeping her attention focused on Nakohe. "And your transfer?" "To Fort Sill. Has that been delayed due to your injury?" "Temporarily," he confirmed. "I leave in 2 weeks, once the doctor confirms I can travel safely." 2 weeks. The knowledge settled like a stone in her chest. "I see." An awkward silence fell, the three of them standing in a triangle of unspoken tensions and social restrictions. Finally, the lieutenant took her elbow firmly. "Mrs. Aldridge, really, we must return now. Good evening, Scout." Nakohe nodded once, his expression revealing nothing. "Good evening, Lieutenant. Mrs. Aldridge." As she allowed herself to be led away, Winnie glanced back over her shoulder. Nakohe remained where they had left him, a solitary figure haloed by the setting sun, watching her departure with unreadable eyes. That night, she lay awake in the narrow infirmary bed, replaying their brief encounter and finding it painfully inadequate after everything they had shared. The formal address, the careful distance, the neutral expressions, all felt like a betrayal of the connection forged in extremity. Yet what had she expected? That they would acknowledge the nights spent talking by firelight? The vulnerability they had shown each other? The moments when social barriers had dissolved, leaving only two human beings seeking warmth and understanding in a cold, indifferent world? Such acknowledgement was impossible here, where every interaction occurred under watchful eyes and rigid expectations. The fort's walls protected against physical threats, but reinforced the invisible barriers between people like her and people like him. 2 weeks until he departed for Indian Territory, a posting that amounted to exile, as he had described it. 2 weeks in which they would pass as strangers, exchanging formal nods if they happened to cross paths. Then he would ride south, and she would remain behind, teaching children whose parents had been willing to let her die. The thought was suddenly, overwhelmingly unacceptable. Winnie sat up in bed, her decision forming with unexpected clarity. She had survived the loss of her husband, the judgment of Philadelphia society, the isolation of frontier life, and the brutal indifference of a blizzard. She had emerged stronger, more certain of her own resilience. Yet the prospect of watching Nkohi leave without speaking the truth that had grown between them seemed a failure of courage she could not bear. Society's expectations had nearly killed her once. She would not allow them to dictate her choices again. The following morning, Winnie began teaching at Coldwater Basin as promised. A military wagon delivered her to the schoolhouse, where 23 children greeted her with a mixture of joy and uncertainty. Their parents hovered at the edges of the room, watching with expressions that ranged from guilt to resentment to genuine relief. Mrs. Aldridge survived a terrible ordeal, Obadiah Thornton announced to the assembled students, his tone suggesting a natural disaster rather than human callousness. "We're blessed by her return and her dedication to your education." She met his gaze steadily, neither contradicting nor affirming his sanitized version of events. The children didn't need to know how their parents had failed her. They carried no responsibility for adult sins. Instead, she smiled warmly at her students and began unpacking books from a crate the fort had provided to replace those lost in her abandoned cabin. "Today," she announced, "we'll be studying courage, what it means to stand firm in adversity, to help others regardless of the cost, to speak truth even when it's unwelcome." She opened a volume of history, but her lesson would draw from more recent experiences than those recorded on its pages. "Not everyone who shows courage carries a sword or wears a uniform," she told the attentive faces before her. "Sometimes the greatest bravery comes from those society overlooks or misunderstands." Several parents shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing the unspoken rebuke, but the children leaned forward, captivated by the intensity in their teacher's normally composed demeanor. Winnie noticed young Thomas Reed watching her with particular attention, his perceptive eyes suggesting he understood more than his 10 years might indicate. The day passed quickly, filled with the familiar rhythm of recitations, arithmetic problems, and geography lessons. When the children left for home, Winnie remained in the schoolhouse, organizing materials for the next day while waiting for the wagon to return her to Fort Kearny. The solitude felt welcome after hours of forced politeness toward a community that had betrayed her trust. She was arranging slates on a shelf when the door opened without a knock. Turning, she found not the expected wagon driver, but Eulalia Winters, the elderly widow who had warned her months ago about the town's character. "Mrs. Winters," Winnie acknowledged, surprised by the visit. "How can I help you?" Eulalia closed the door against the chill, her wrinkled face solemn beneath a woolen shawl. "It's not help I've come for, Mrs. Aldridge, but to offer what's owed." "I'm afraid I don't understand." "An apology," the old woman said simply, moving to sit on one of the student benches. Not from the town. They're too proud for proper contrition, but from me, who knew what might happen and didn't do enough to prevent it. Winnie set down the slate she'd been holding. You warned me before the storm. That was more than anyone else did. A warning without action is just empty breath, Eulalia replied, shaking her head. I should have insisted you stay with me when the blizzard came. I knew how the council would behave. I've seen it before. Her gaze drifted to the window where late afternoon light cast long shadows across the schoolyard. This town has a history of abandoning those it considers outsiders when times turn harsh. Something in her tone suggested personal knowledge rather than general observation. Winnie pulled a chair close to the older woman's bench and sat. What happened? Eulalia was silent for a moment, her gnarled hands twisting in her lap. 27 years ago, a Pawnee family was caught in Coldwater Basin during an early winter storm. A father, mother, and 2 small children. They'd come to trade, not to cause trouble. She sighed heavily. The town refused them shelter, claimed there wasn't space, wasn't food to spare, sent them away despite knowing what awaited beyond our borders. They died, Winnie said softly, the statement not a question. Eulalia nodded. All 4 found frozen less than 3 miles from town when the snow melted in spring. Her eyes, clouded with age but sharp with memory, met Winnie's directly. My husband was mayor then. He voted with the others to turn them away. I never forgave him for it, though I lacked the courage to leave him. The confession hung in the air between them, a ghost from the past that suddenly seemed connected to Winnie's own ordeal through invisible threads of repeated history. The same men who sit on the council now, their fathers sat on it then, Eulalia continued. The sin passes from generation to generation, wrapped in different justifications, but unchanged at its core. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. And now they've done it again, to you. But this time, Providence sent someone to intervene. Nakohe, Winnie said, the name feeling significant somehow, as though speaking it aloud. Acknowledged a truth the town would prefer, remained unspoken. The Comanche scout, Eulalia confirmed. People whisper about it, a savage saving a white woman. They can't decide whether to be grateful or scandalized. A smile briefly creased her weathered face. I find their discomfort rather satisfying. Despite everything, Winnie laughed, a short, genuine sound that felt like release. So do I, she admitted. Eulalia studied her for a long moment, her expression softening. You've changed, Mrs. Aldridge. The wilderness and its trials have tempered you. Perhaps I've simply discovered who I truly am, beyond society's constraints. That's the most valuable discovery any soul can make, the older woman observed. She reached into her shawl and withdrew a small package wrapped in oilcloth. This is for you. I had it made after hearing about your rescue. Curious, Winnie unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a brooch crafted from polished silver, its design a simple but elegant rendering of a bear. She looked up questioningly. Nakohe, Eulalia explained. In Comanche it means bear. Did you know? Winnie shook her head, her fingers tracing the outline of the brooch. He had never translated his name during their time together. A reminder, the older woman said, that strength comes in forms we don't always recognize until we need it most. She stood with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested every change in position. Wear it or don't, that's your choice, but remember what it represents. After Eulalia left, Winnie remained seated, the silver bear warm in her palm. She thought of Nakohe's quiet strength, his dignity in the face of prejudice, the way he had risked his life for a stranger, when an entire town had turned its back on her. The brooch felt significant beyond its material value, a talisman connecting her to experiences that had transformed her understanding of herself and the world. She pinned it to her collar just as the wagon arrived to return her to the fort. The days settled into a new pattern, teaching in Coldwater Basin during daylight hours, returning to Fort Kearny each evening. The military escorts who transported her maintained professional courtesy but clear bafflement at her arrangement. Women of her station didn't typically choose such unorthodox living conditions, especially when a perfectly respectable cabin adjoined the schoolhouse. At the fort, she took her meals in the officers' dining room at Colonel Brennan's invitation, listening to conversations about military strategies and territorial politics with quiet attentiveness. The officers' wives offered friendship of a sort, though their careful inquiries about her ordeal always delicately avoided mentioning Nakohe directly, as though his role in her survival was somehow improper. "You must have been terrified," Mrs. Brennan remarked during one dinner, her voice lowered conspiratorially, "being at the mercy of, well, someone not fully civilized." Winnie set down her fork deliberately. "On the contrary, Mrs. Brennan, I witnessed more civilization in Nakohe's actions than in those of Coldwater Basin's most prominent citizens." She touched the silver bear brooch at her collar. "He risked his life for a stranger when those who claimed Christian charity abandoned me to die." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Colonel Brennan cleared his throat. "Yes, well, Scout Nakohe has proven reliable in his duties. We value his service to the fort." "How fortunate for him to be valued for his usefulness," Winnie replied, her tone mild, but her meaning pointed. After that evening, invitations to dine with the officers became less frequent. Winnie found she preferred taking meals alone in her quarters, where she could read without the strain of censoring her thoughts or pretending comfort with prevailing attitudes. She caught glimpses of Nakohe occasionally, crossing the parade ground, conferring with cavalry officers about tracking routes, exercising his mare despite his still healing arm. Each time they exchanged formal nods, but nothing more. The distance between them felt both necessary and unbearable, a chasm created not by their own choices, but by the expectations that surrounded them. A week after she began teaching again, Winnie encountered Dr. Patterson in the fort's small library, where she had gone to borrow books for her students. The doctor was examining a medical text with such absorption that he didn't notice her entrance until she cleared her throat. "Mrs. Aldridge," he acknowledged, closing his book, "how are you feeling? Any lingering effects from your exposure?" "None, thank you. Your care has been exemplary." He nodded, seemingly pleased with her recovery, but hesitant to end the conversation. After a moment, he said, "I've been treating Scout Nakohe's arm. He mentioned that you set the bone initially." "I did what was necessary," she replied carefully, unsure where this discussion might lead. "It was excellently done." The doctor's tone held genuine professional admiration. "Clean alignment, proper stabilization. I've seen army surgeons do worse under better conditions." "My husband described field medicine in his letters from the front," she explained. "I never expected to apply such knowledge, but necessity proves a thorough teacher." Dr. Patterson studied her with newfound respect. "Indeed, it does." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "He's leaving tomorrow. The colonel approved his departure for Fort Sill now that the arm shows sufficient healing." The news hit Winnie with unexpected force. She had known Nakohe's transfer was imminent, but hearing the specific timing made it suddenly, painfully real. "Tomorrow," she repeated, struggling to maintain a neutral expression. "So soon." "The army moves according to its own schedules, not personal convenience." The doctor's tone suggested resigned familiarity with military priorities. He glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then continued in a lower voice. "He asked about you. whether you were adjusting well to your arrangement with Coldwater Basin. It seemed important to him to know you were settled before he departed. Winnie felt something catch in her throat. Gratitude, perhaps, or grief at this small evidence of Nakohe's continued concern, despite their enforced distance. What did you tell him? That you appeared resilient and determined, Patterson replied, a slight smile softening his usually worried features. He seemed satisfied with that assessment. Thank you, she said quietly. The doctor nodded, then surprised her with an unexpected observation. You know, Mrs. Aldridge, medicine has taught me that human beings are remarkably similar beneath their skin. Blood runs red regardless of ancestry. Pain feels the same, whether experienced by general or private, society lady or laundress. He met her gaze directly. Perhaps other aspects of human experience share this universality. The carefully worded statement, neither explicitly approving nor condemning any particular connection, nonetheless acknowledged what most at the fort studiously ignored, that shared survival might forge bonds that transcended social boundaries. Perhaps they do, Doctor, she agreed, grateful for this small kindness. That night, Winnie barely slept, her thoughts circling restlessly around Nakohe's imminent departure. By morning, dark shadows underlined her eyes, visible despite her efforts to conceal them with careful grooming. She went through her teaching day mechanically, her mind elsewhere, even as she guided her students through their lessons. When the final bell rang and the children scattered homeward, she requested the wagon driver wait an additional hour, claiming administrative tasks that required her attention. Instead, once alone, she sat at her desk and wrote rapidly, filling pages with words that had been building inside her since their return to the fort. She wrote of gratitude that went beyond conventional thanks, of discoveries made in firelight, about strength and vulnerability, of poetry shared in a sanctuary carved from stone. She wrote of worlds that collided unexpectedly and the rare courage required to acknowledge truth, regardless of society's judgment. She wrote not as Mrs. Aldridge, the respectable widow, but as Winnie, the woman who had emerged from a Nebraska blizzard forever changed. When finished, she sealed the letter carefully and tucked it into her bag. The wagon returned her to Fort Kearney just as evening shadows lengthened across the plains. Rather than going directly to her quarters, she sought out the stables where scouts typically prepared for departures. Nakohe was there, checking his mare's saddle and packs with methodical attention. His splinted arm clearly hampered his movements, but he worked around the limitation with practiced adaptability. He looked up at her approach, surprise briefly crossing his features before his expression settled into careful neutrality. Mrs. Aldridge, he acknowledged, straightening to his full height. I heard you're leaving tomorrow, she said without preamble. He nodded once. At first light. A stable hand moved nearby, forcing their conversation into conventional channels despite the weight of unspoken words between them. Winnie glanced at the young soldier, then back to Nakohe. I wanted to thank you properly before you departed, she said, loudly enough for the stable hand to hear. Your heroism saved my life, and I'm eternally grateful. I was doing my duty, he replied, the formal response so at odds with their shared reality that she nearly winced. Nevertheless, she continued, extending her hand with the sealed letter, partially concealed within her palm, I've written a commendation to Colonel Brennan regarding your actions. I thought you might want to review it before I submit it. Understanding dawned in his eyes as he accepted the letter, his fingers briefly touching hers in a contact that felt significant despite its brevity. Very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Aldridge. The stable hand moved away, drawn by duties elsewhere. As soon as they were alone, Nakohe's posture shifted subtly, the military formality replaced by the more natural bearing she remembered from their days in the cave. He glanced down at the letter in his hand, then back to her face. "This isn't a commendation," he observed quietly. "No," she admitted. "It's what I couldn't say in the presence of others." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes revealing a complexity of emotion that his carefully controlled features concealed. "I leave at dawn," he finally said, the words carrying more meaning than their literal content. "I know." Winnie touched the silver bear brooch at her collar. "I learned what your name means." His gaze followed the movement, recognition flickering across his features. "Who told you?" "Mrs. Winters, an elderly widow in Coldwater Basin. She had this made for me." Winnie's fingers traced the polished contours of the brooch. "She said it represents strength we don't always recognize until we need it most." "A perceptive woman," Nakohe remarked, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. Winnie took a deep breath, gathering courage for words she had rehearsed throughout the day. "I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever paths lie before us, I will never forget what happened in that cave. Not just the rescue, but the conversations, the poetry, the truth we shared when no one was watching." His expression remained carefully controlled, but something in his eyes responded to her honesty. "Nor will I," he replied simply. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with possibilities neither could voice aloud. Finally, Winnie stepped back, restoring the proper distance that propriety demanded. "Safe journey, Nakohe," she said formally, aware that anyone observing would see only an appropriate farewell between rescuer and rescued. He inclined his head slightly. "Farewell, Mrs. Aldridge." She turned and walked away, her steps measured despite the urge to look back. She would not make this more difficult for either of them by prolonging a goodbye that shouldn't have been necessary at all, in a world less rigidly defined by arbitrary boundaries. That night, alone in her quarters, Winnie opened the volume of Tennyson they had salvaged from the collapsed line shack. The pages fell naturally to Ulysses, the poem she had read aloud while Nakohe listened with such intensity. One line caught her attention anew. "I am a part of all that I have met." The words resonated with unexpected depth. She was indeed part of all she had encountered. James, Philadelphia society, Coldwater Basin's prejudices, Nebraska's harsh wilderness, and most recently, Nakohe himself. Each experience had shaped her, but none had defined her completely. She remained Winifred Aldridge, continuously evolving beyond others' limited perceptions. Dawn arrived with a clarity that belied her sleepless night. From her window, Winnie watched the fort stirring to life. Soldiers emerging for morning drills, smoke rising from cooking fires, the flag being raised with ceremonial precision. She caught a distant glimpse of a solitary rider departing through the eastern gate, too far to distinguish features, but unmistakable in his fluid, natural seat upon the horse. Nakohe riding toward Fort Sill and whatever uncertain future awaited him there. She watched until his silhouette disappeared against the horizon, then turned away to prepare for another day of teaching children whose parents had nearly caused her death. Life resumed its structured rhythm. Days in the classroom, evenings at the fort, polite exchanges with military personnel who gradually accepted her unconventional arrangement as merely another Eastern eccentricity. Winnie threw herself into teaching with renewed dedication, as though pouring knowledge into young minds might compensate for the emptiness that had settled in her chest since watching a lone rider disappear eastward. 2 weeks after Nakohe's departure, she received an unexpected visitor at the schoolhouse after dismissing her students. Lieutenant James Parker, a young officer from the fort, whom she knew only slightly, arrived on horseback just as she was gathering materials for the return journey. "Mrs. Aldridge," he greeted her, removing his hat as he entered the schoolroom. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Lieutenant," she replied, covering her surprise with ingrained social grace. What brings you to Coldwater Basin? He shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with his mission. I've been asked to deliver this to you, ma'am. He extended a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, as though it had traveled some distance. It arrived by dispatch rider from Fort Sill yesterday. Winnie accepted the paper, her heart suddenly beating faster. Thank you, Lieutenant. May I ask why you were chosen as messenger rather than my usual escort? Parker cleared his throat. The colonel thought it appropriate that correspondence of this nature be delivered discreetly. Ma'am, the implication was clear. Whatever the letter contained, Fort Kearny's command considered it potentially problematic for her reputation. Winnie nodded as though this made perfect sense. How thoughtful of Colonel Brennan. Please convey my appreciation for his concern. The young officer appeared relieved that she wasn't demanding explanations. Shall I wait outside while you review it, ma'am, in case there's a reply to be conveyed? That won't be necessary, she assured him. I'll be returning to the fort within the hour and can address any response directly. When Parker had departed, Winnie sat at her desk, the folded paper growing warm in her hand. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the same careful script that had addressed her as Mrs. Aldridge on supply requisitions and official communications during their time at Fort Kearny. Only now, the paper was addressed simply to Winnie. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside was a single page covered in Nakohe's distinctive handwriting. Winnie, your letter reached places within me I thought long closed to the world. Know that whatever happens, I too carry the memory of firelight conversations, poetry shared in darkness, and truths spoken without fear. Fort Sill is as expected, a place where my skills are valued but my humanity questioned daily. Yet I find myself strangely at peace. Perhaps because part of me now exists elsewhere, in memories you also hold. I've enclosed something I've never shared with another person, a page from the system of writing I created to record my thoughts in a language, neither fully Comanche nor English. On it, I've transcribed the final lines of Ulysses that seem to speak to us both. The army moves me constantly, but letters sent to Fort Sill will eventually find me, should you wish to write again. Nakohe. Only after reading the letter. Twice did Winnie notice a second, smaller piece of paper that had fallen to her desk. On it were strange, beautiful symbols. Neither English letters nor any other alphabet she recognized, but clearly meaningful in their careful arrangement. At the bottom, Nakohe had written a translation: to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Winnie traced the unfamiliar symbols with her fingertip, understanding the profound significance of what he had shared. A private language, a bridge between worlds that belonged solely to him, now partially entrusted to her. The gesture moved her in ways a conventional letter never could have. She slipped both pages into her pocket before gathering her teaching materials and stepping outside to meet the waiting wagon. The driver, a corporal assigned regularly to her transportation, tipped his hat respectfully. To the fort, ma'am? Winnie paused, considering the question more deeply than the corporal intended. To the fort, to continue her current existence, indefinitely teaching children during the day and returning to increasing isolation each evening. To the fort, where she was treated with superficial respect but fundamental incomprehension. To the fort, where every day reminded her of Nakohe's absence and the rigid structures that had separated them. The leather-bound journal in her hands, a gift from her Philadelphia family that she'd been using to record teaching notes, suddenly felt significant. Its blank pages represented possibilities yet unwritten, choices yet unmade. "Corporal," she said, making a decision that had perhaps been forming since the moment she awoke in a line shack to find a half-Comanche scout had saved her life. I need to speak with Colonel Brennan this evening about changing my arrangements. Yes, ma'am, the corporal replied, helping her into the wagon without question. Military training discouraged curiosity about his passengers' intentions. As they traveled toward Fort Kearney, Winnie gazed across the Nebraska landscape, still, patched with snow, but showing the first tentative signs of spring's approach. She thought of Eulalia Winter's words about discovering one's true self beyond society's constraints. She thought of Dr. Patterson's observation that human experiences shared fundamental similarities regardless of exterior differences. Most of all, she thought of Nakohe's letter and the private language he had shared, a symbol of bridges that could be built between worlds if one had sufficient courage. By the time they reached the fort, her decision had solidified from vague impulse to clear intention. She requested an immediate meeting with Colonel Brennan, who received her in his office with the slightly distracted air of a man with more pressing concerns than a schoolteacher's administrative requests. Mrs. Aldridge, he greeted her, gesturing to a chair opposite his desk. What can I do for you this evening? I've come to inform you of a change in my circumstances, she began, her voice steadier than she had expected. I will be fulfilling my teaching contract with Coldwater Basin, which ends on May 15th. After that date, I plan to depart the territory. Brennan nodded, clearly unsurprised. Most Eastern transplants eventually returned home, especially after difficult experiences on the frontier. Back to Philadelphia, I presume. A wise decision. The East offers more suitable conditions for a lady of your background. Not Philadelphia, Winnie corrected. I've accepted a position establishing a school for children of mixed heritage near Fort Sill in Indian Territory. The colonel's eyebrows rose sharply. Fort Sill? Mrs. Aldridge, surely you're aware that's a frontier posting in the heart of Comanche territory. Hardly a suitable placement for someone of your situation. My situation, she repeated with deliberate emphasis, is that of an educated teacher with experience instructing diverse students. The position was offered by the Indian Affairs Office, who are attempting to create educational opportunities beyond the standard reservation schools. This wasn't entirely accurate. No such offer had been made, but Winnie had spent enough time in military environments to understand how information was structured and presented. She would write to the Indian Affairs Office tomorrow, proposing exactly the program she had just described. Whether they accepted remained to be seen, but the official-sounding description gave her plan the veneer of institutional approval that Brennan would respect. The colonel frowned, clearly struggling to find an appropriate response that balanced military propriety with his evident concern for her welfare. Mrs. Aldridge, while I admire your, humanitarian impulses, I feel obligated to point out the dangers involved. The recent troubles with the southern tribes make Indian Territory volatile at best and potentially lethal at worst for unprotected settlers. I appreciate your concern, Colonel, she replied smoothly, but I'll hardly be unprotected at a military installation. Fort Sill houses several companies of regular army troops, as I understand it. Well, yes, but still, he trailed off, unable to articulate his objections without venturing into territory that military decorum prevented him from addressing directly. Perhaps you should reconsider this decision after some reflection. Experiences such as yours, the abandonment, the rescue, can lead to emotional responses that seem reasonable in the moment, but prove impractical upon further consideration. The condescension might have angered her months ago. Now it merely confirmed the rightness of her decision. My mind is quite settled, Colonel Brennan. I simply wanted to inform you of my plans out of courtesy, given your generous hospitality during my recovery. Recognizing the futility of further argument, Brennan nodded stiffly. Very well, Mrs. Aldridge. We'll arrange transport to the nearest Stagecoach station, when your teaching contract concludes. He hesitated, then added with awkward sincerity, I do hope you'll reconsider before then. The frontier has already asked more of you than any gentlewoman should have to bear. On the contrary, Winnie replied as she rose to leave, the frontier has given me exactly what I needed, clarity about who I am and what matters most. Word of Winnie's planned departure spread through Fort Kearney with the efficiency of a military telegraph. By morning, the officers' wives regarded her with a mixture of pity and scandal-tinged fascination. The younger lieutenants exchanged meaningful glances whenever she passed. Even Dr. Patterson, who had shown her genuine kindness, approached with concerned hesitation during her weekly checkup. Indian Territory, Mrs. Aldridge? He asked as he examined her healing hands. Are you certain that's wise? Wisdom is relative, Doctor, she replied calmly. What seems foolish to some may be perfectly sensible to others with different priorities. He nodded slowly, replacing his stethoscope in his medical bag. I suppose that's true enough. After a pause, he added in a lower voice, I received a letter from Fort Sill yesterday. Scout Nakohi's arm is healing well, though he apparently refused to remain on light duty as recommended. The casual mention of Nakohi, the first time anyone at the fort had spoken his name directly to her since his departure, caught Winnie off guard. I'm pleased to hear it, she managed, striving for a neutral tone despite the sudden quickening of her pulse. Dr. Patterson studied her with shrewd kindness. Mrs. Aldridge, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but as your physician, I feel some obligation to consider your complete well-being. He hesitated, then continued. The human heart doesn't always conform to society's expectations. Medical science has long recognized this, even if polite company refuses to acknowledge it. The oblique statement, neither explicit approval nor condemnation, nonetheless represented the closest anyone had come to acknowledging what might lie beneath her decision to relocate. Winnie met his gaze directly, neither confirming nor denying his implied understanding. Thank you, Doctor. I've always valued your professional insight. He nodded once, accepting her response for what it was. Appreciation for his discretion, rather than invitation to further discussion. You're fully recovered physically, he declared, returning to his formal manner. I see no medical reason to recommend against travel, though I would advise waiting until the spring roads are more passable. As April's unpredictable weather gradually yielded to more consistent warmth, Winnie devoted herself to ensuring her students would be prepared for whatever teacher followed her. She created detailed lesson plans, organized the school's meager library into a more usable system, and spent extra time with students who struggled with particular subjects. Young Thomas Reed, the boy with exceptional mathematical aptitude, seemed especially affected by news of her upcoming departure. One afternoon, as other children hurried home, he lingered at his desk, rolling a pencil between his fingers with unusual hesitation. Mrs. Aldridge, he finally said, his 10-year-old voice straining for adult composure. Is it true you're leaving? Because of what happened during the blizzard? The directness of the question, something no adult in Coldwater Basin had dared ask, momentarily startled her. Winnie considered her response carefully, aware that children deserved honesty, but not burdened with complexities beyond their years. Partly, she acknowledged, sitting at the desk beside his. What happened showed me some truths about this town, but also about myself. Thomas nodded seriously. My pa says you're going to teach Indian children instead. He says it's a waste. And what do you think, Thomas? The boy looked surprised at being asked his opinion. After a moment's thought, he replied, I think everyone deserves to learn, no matter who they are. He paused, then added with the devastating insight sometimes found in children, but I think maybe you're going there for the scout who saved. You aren't you? Heat rose to Winnie's cheeks despite her best efforts at composure. "What makes you say that?" "Because you touch that bear pin whenever someone mentions Indians or the fort where he went," Thomas explained matter-of-factly. "And because you look different when you talk about him, not scared like everyone thinks you should be." Winnie found herself speechless before this child's perception. After a moment she asked, "Does that bother you, Thomas?" He considered. "This seriously?" "No, ma'am. My uncle fought with colored soldiers in the war. He said they bled the same as white men and showed just as much courage." He shrugged with childish simplicity. "Seems to me a man who'd save someone from freezing must be a good person, no matter where he comes from." In that moment, Winnie saw hope for a future beyond the prejudices that had shaped the current generation. "That's very wise, Thomas. I wish more adults shared your perspective." The boy beamed at the praise, then grew serious again. "Mrs. Aldridge, when you start your new school, could I write to you sometimes about mathematics and such?" Touched by the request, Winnie nodded. "I would like that very much. Perhaps we could correspond about your progress and any interesting problems you encounter." His face brightened immediately. "I'd work extra hard if I knew you'd see it." "Then we have an arrangement," she said, extending her hand formally as though sealing a business agreement. Thomas shook it with solemn dignity before gathering his books and rushing from the schoolhouse, his concerns apparently resolved. That evening, alone in her quarters at the fort, Winnie wrote a lengthy letter to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, proposing the establishment of a school near Fort Sill that would serve children regardless of heritage. She outlined a curriculum that would include traditional academic subjects alongside practical skills and cultural understanding, emphasizing the potential benefits for peaceful relations between settlers and native populations. Whether the Bureau would respond favorably remained uncertain, but the act of writing, of transforming vague intentions into concrete plans, crystallized her determination. She was no longer fleeing from Coldwater Basin's betrayal, or even simply following Nakohe. She was moving toward a purpose that felt increasingly meaningful, a chance to create something valuable in a place where artificial boundaries between peoples might be more permeable than in established communities. The following. Weeks passed in steady preparation. Winnie catalogued her few possessions, ordered necessary supplies to be delivered to Fort Sill, and corresponded with the stagecoach company regarding schedules and routes. She also wrote regularly to Nakohe, their letters exchanging news of daily life, but gradually deepening to include reflections on their shared experiences and hopes for the future. His responses arrived less frequently due to his scouting duties, but each one revealed more of the man behind the careful facade he had maintained at Fort Kearney. He wrote of tracking expeditions through territories his mother's people had once freely roamed, of nights spent beneath stars that seemed to speak in ancient tongues, of his growing disillusionment with an army that used his skills while dismissing his humanity. "I find myself increasingly between worlds," he wrote in one letter, "valued for my ability to navigate both settler and native territories, but trusted in neither. Perhaps that is why your proposed school speaks to something deep within me, the possibility of a place where such divisions might blur or even dissolve entirely." Winnie kept his letters in a small wooden box beneath her bed, reading them by lamplight when the fort had settled into nighttime quiet. Sometimes she traced the symbols of his personal written language, which he had begun teaching her through their correspondence, finding something intimate and profound in learning to communicate in a form that existed nowhere else in the world. As her departure date approached, unexpected visitors arrived at the schoolhouse one afternoon after classes had ended. Obadiah Thornton and Jeremiah Flint entered without knocking, their expressions suggesting a mission of some importance. Winnie greeted them with the polite distance she had maintained since returning to teaching. "Gentlemen, What brings you here today? Thornton cleared his throat importantly. Mrs. Aldridge, the town council has been discussing your situation. My situation seems perfectly clear, she replied, continuing to organize student papers rather than giving them her full attention. I'll complete my contract on May 15th as agreed. Yes, well, about that. Thornton exchanged glances with Flint before continuing. We've decided to offer you an extension, 2 more years with a 15% increase in salary. Now, Winnie looked up genuinely surprised. May I ask what prompted this sudden generosity? Flint shifted uncomfortably. Finding qualified teachers willing to relocate to Nebraska isn't easy, Mrs. Aldridge. You've proven your abilities with our children. Despite my unorthodox living arrangements? She asked pointedly. Water under the bridge, Thornton declared, with forced joviality. The town is prepared to renovate your cabin properly, ensure regular delivery of supplies. Whatever inconveniences you experienced during the winter won't be repeated. Winnie studied them thoughtfully, recognizing the practical calculation behind their offer. A new teacher would require recruitment, transportation, and adjustment time. Better to retain the devil they knew, especially one who had demonstrated her effectiveness despite her increasingly evident unorthodox views. I appreciate the offer, she said carefully, but my decision is made. I've already accepted a position elsewhere. Thornton's expression hardened slightly. This school for savages you're supposedly establishing? Mrs. Aldridge, surely you realize such endeavors rarely succeed. The native mind isn't suited to proper education. How fascinating, Winnie replied, her tone cool. I've found intelligence distributed quite equally across humanity, regardless of background. The limitations usually lie in opportunity rather than capacity. Be that as it may, Flint interjected hastily, sensing Thornton's rising color. We're offering security, respectability. This new position offers neither. Perhaps I value different qualities now, she suggested, returning to her papers in a clear dismissal. My contract ends on the 15th. I'll ensure everything is in order for my replacement. After they departed, Winnie sat alone in the quiet schoolroom, considering their offer with more objectivity than she had shown in their presence. They weren't entirely wrong about the challenges ahead. Establishing a new school in disputed territory would involve difficulties she could scarcely imagine. The familiar path, remaining in Coldwater Basin with increased salary and improved conditions, represented the safer choice by any conventional measure. Yet something fundamental had shifted within her during those days in the wilderness. Safety now seemed less valuable than authenticity. Respectability paled beside purpose. The path of greatest certainty no longer attracted her as it once had. She touched the silver bear brooch at her collar, a gesture that had become almost unconscious, a tactile reminder of strength discovered through adversity. The decision was already made, not in haste or romance, but in the clear-eyed recognition of who she had become and what she now valued most. That evening, a letter arrived from Washington, the Bureau of Indian Affairs responding to her proposal. Winnie opened it with steady hands despite her racing heart. The bureaucratic language was difficult to parse at first, filled with qualifications and conditions, but the essential message emerged from the formal verbiage: conditional approval for a pilot program, minimal funding contingent upon quarterly reports demonstrating progress, and a 6-month probationary period after which continued support would be evaluated. Not an enthusiastic endorsement, certainly, but an official authorization that legitimized her plans. She would not arrive at Fort Sill as merely a woman chasing connection with a scout who had saved her life, but as a government-appointed educator with purpose beyond personal considerations. The distinction mattered, not just for her reputation, but for her own understanding of her motivations. Whatever drew her to Nakohe, and she no longer denied the depth of that connection, it existed alongside, rather than instead of her professional aspirations. The school represented something she believed in independently, a chance to create a space where divisions of race and background might be bridged through shared knowledge. May arrived with unexpected swiftness, bringing warmer days and the inevitable. Farewell to her students. On her final day of teaching, they presented her with handmade gifts, a quilt sewn by the older girls, wooden carvings from the boys, carefully pressed wildflowers arranged in a book. The simple offerings moved her, more than elaborate Philadelphia party favors ever had. Thomas Reed gave her a small journal filled with mathematical problems he had created himself, each one annotated with his observations about patterns and relationships between numbers. On the inside cover, he had written in careful script, "For Mrs. Aldridge, who taught me that learning belongs to everyone. I hope Indian Territory has many students who love numbers as much as I do. I'll write to you about each problem as I solve it," Winnie promised, genuinely touched by the boy's thoughtfulness. After the children left for the final time, Winnie remained in the schoolhouse, moving slowly through the space that had been the center of her life for nearly a year. She straightened books, organized supplies for her successor, and finally stood at the front of the room, looking at empty desks that seemed to hold ghostly impressions of students past and future. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Expecting the wagon driver who would return her to Fort Kearny, she called, "Come in!" Instead, Eulalia Winters entered, leaning on a carved walking stick that seemed less an aid to mobility than an extension of her dignified presence. "Saying goodbye to your domain, I see," the elderly woman observed, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Just ensuring everything is in order," Winnie replied. Eulalia nodded, making her way to the teacher's desk and lowering herself onto the chair with the careful movements of advanced age. "I won't keep you long. I merely wanted to give you something before you depart for your new adventure." She reached into her shawl and withdrew a small leather pouch. "This was my mother's. She brought it from Scotland when she came to this country as a girl." Curious, Winnie accepted the pouch and opened it. Inside lay a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a compass rose, aged to a soft patina that spoke of generations of handling. "A traveler's blessing," Eulalia explained, "given to those embarking on journeys where the destination matters less than the purpose." Her weathered face softened with a rare smile. "My mother would have approved of you, Winifred Aldridge. She had no patience for arbitrary boundaries either." Winnie examined the pendant with appreciation for both its beauty and significance. "This is an heirloom, Mrs. Winters. I can't possibly accept—" "You can and you will," the older woman interrupted firmly. "I have no daughters to pass it to, and my sons' wives would merely lock it away as a curiosity. You'll wear it as it's meant to be worn, by a woman finding her own way regardless of what others think proper." Understanding that refusal would cause more offense than acceptance, Winnie nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I'll treasure it." "See that you do." Eulalia stood with deliberate dignity. "Now, one last piece of advice from an old woman who's seen more of life than most in this town could imagine. When you find truth, hold to it without apology. I spent too many years accommodating others' comfortable lies rather than living my own honest reality." The words resonated deeply with Winnie, who recognized in this elderly widow's regrets a warning against compromises that diminished rather than enhanced one's life. "I'll remember that," she promised. Eulalia nodded once, satisfied. "Good. Now, go build your school, teach your children, and live your truth. The rest will follow as it should." After the older woman departed, Winnie fastened the compass rose pendant around her neck, where it hung alongside the silver bear brooch, twin, symbols of the journey behind and the path ahead, connected by newfound clarity about her own nature and purpose. The following morning, Winnie departed Fort Kearny without ceremony, Colonel Brennan's aide delivered formal travel documents and a surprisingly generous letter of introduction to the commanding officer at Fort Sill, evidently deciding that if she insisted on this unconventional path, the army would at least ensure she arrived safely. The stagecoach journey proved arduous even in spring conditions. Roads washed out by melting snow sometimes forced passengers to disembark, while drivers navigated treacherous passages. Accommodations at way stations varied from rudimentary to barely habitable. Fellow travelers changed at each stop, though most regarded Winnie with curiosity when they learned her destination. "Indian Territory?" one matron exclaimed, her face pinching with disapproval. "My dear, whatever possessed you to choose such a place? The savages there are barely controlled by the army." Rather than engaging in futile explanation, Winnie merely smiled pleasantly and redirected the conversation. Experience had taught her that certain perspectives remained fixed regardless of contrary evidence or argumentation. Her energy was better, reserved for those whose minds remained sufficiently open to consider alternative viewpoints. 10 days into the journey, their stagecoach was delayed by a broken wheel on a remote stretch between settlements. As the driver and his assistant worked on repairs, passengers stretched their legs beside the road, grateful for a respite from constant jostling, despite the inconvenience. Winnie wandered a short distance from the others, breathing deeply of air scented with spring growth. The landscape had changed noticeably as they traveled south, the flat Nebraska plains giving way to gently rolling hills dotted with trees, whose new leaves formed a delicate green canopy against the sky. She was examining a particular wildflower when hoofbeats approached from the direction they had been traveling. Looking up, she saw a rider moving at steady pace toward the stalled stagecoach. As he drew nearer, her heart began a peculiar drumming against her ribs. Even at a distance, she recognized the fluid grace with which the rider sat his horse, the particular angle of his shoulders, the careful alertness with which he surveyed the surroundings. Before conscious thought formed, her hand rose to touch the silver bear brooch at her collar. Nahkohe. He slowed his mount as he approached the stagecoach, exchanging words with the driver that Winnie couldn't hear. Then, as the driver gestured toward the scattered passengers, Nakohe's gaze swept across the area until it found her standing apart from the others. For a moment, neither moved. Then he guided his horse toward her with deliberate calm, stopping at a respectful distance that nonetheless felt too far after months of separation, bridged only by letters. "Mrs. Aldridge," he greeted her, his formal tone belied by the warmth. In his dark eyes, "The fort received word of your impending arrival. Colonel Richards sent me to escort the stagecoach safely through Comanche territory." Winnie struggled to match his composure, though she suspected her expression revealed more than she intended. "A fortuitous assignment, Scout Nakohe?" "Indeed." The slightest smile touched his lips. "Though perhaps not entirely coincidental, Colonel Richards seems to have developed a curious interest in educational initiatives since receiving certain correspondence from Washington." Understanding dawned. Nakohe had somehow influenced his commanding officer to assign him this particular duty. Winnie felt warmth spreading through her chest at this evidence that he had anticipated her arrival with the same eagerness she felt. "How fortunate for the passengers to have such experienced guidance," she replied, maintaining the public fiction their circumstances required. His gaze held hers for a moment longer than strictly necessary, conveying silent understanding of their shared game. Then he turned his attention to the coach, where repairs appeared nearly complete. "We should reach Fort Sill by nightfall tomorrow if there are no further delays," he informed her, his tone professionally neutral once more. "The terrain grows more challenging ahead, but nothing the coach can't manage with proper guidance." "I'm grateful for your expertise," she said sincerely. "This journey has presented more difficulties than I anticipated." Something softened briefly in his expression, Most worthwhile destinations do, Mrs. Aldridge. The driver called for passengers to reboard, interrupting their conversation. As Winnie moved toward the coach, Nakohe spoke again, his voice pitched, for her ears alone. "Your letters sustained me," he said simply. The quiet admission, so at odds with his carefully maintained public persona, touched her deeply. "As yours did me," she replied, allowing herself one unguarded moment before, rejoining her fellow travelers. From that point onward, Nakohe rode beside the coach, sometimes ranging ahead to scout the trail, other times dropping back to ensure they weren't followed. Winnie caught glimpses of him through the window, his profile against the sky, his attentive posture as he scanned the horizon, his occasional quiet exchanges with the driver about road conditions ahead. His presence transformed the journey's final leg, lending it a significance beyond mere travel. Each mile brought them closer, not just to Fort Sill, but to the uncertain future they had separately chosen and now approached together. Whatever awaited them, success or failure, acceptance or rejection, would be faced with the strength forged in shared survival and sustained through months of separation. That evening, they made camp earlier than usual, the driver explaining that the next suitable stopping point lay too far ahead to reach before nightfall. Passengers were advised to stretch their legs and prepare for a night of limited comfort. Winnie helped an elderly couple arrange their bedrolls near the fire, then walked to the edge of the camp where Nakohe stood, examining the darkening sky. "Will it rain?" she asked, following his gaze to clouds gathering on the western horizon. "Not until morning," he replied, turning slightly toward her. "The wind carries the scent of distant water, but it's moving slowly." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, ostensibly observing weather patterns, but actually savoring the simple pleasure of proximity after months of separation. Finally, Nakohe spoke again, his voice lowered to ensure privacy. "Your school proposal was approved?" Winnie nodded. "Conditionally. The Bureau provided minimal funds for a 6-month trial period. After that, continued support depends on demonstrated progress. Progress measured by whose standards?" The question revealed his understanding of the fundamental challenge, reconciling government expectations with the actual needs of children from diverse backgrounds. "Officially, by standardized examinations and attendance records," she acknowledged. "Unofficially, I hope to demonstrate value that transcends such limited metrics." He nodded thoughtfully. "You may find more support at Fort Sill than you expect. The new commanding officer, Colonel Richards, is unusually open-minded about relations with native populations. His wife has established reading classes for laundresses and enlisted men's families, regardless of background." This unexpected information buoyed Winnie's spirits. "That's encouraging. I'd anticipated more resistance based on my experiences at Fort Kearny." "There will still be opposition," Nakohe cautioned. "Some officers resent any initiative that treats Indians as equal to whites. Some tribal elders distrust education offered by the government that confined them to reservations." He glanced toward her, his expression softening. "But there are also those who recognize the value in what you propose, a place where children might learn from each other as much as from books." The simple statement confirmed what Winnie had hoped, that Nakohe understood and supported her. Educational vision beyond any personal connection between them. "In Philadelphia, I taught children segregated by wealth and social position," she explained. "Here the divisions appear different, but serve the same purpose, maintaining separation, where sharing might prove more beneficial to all." "A radical perspective," he observed, though his tone suggested admiration rather than criticism. "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but after nearly freezing to death because of artificial boundaries between people, I find myself less patient with Conventions that diminish rather than enhance human potential. Nako's expression grew more serious. The world doesn't change easily, Winnie. What you envision, a school where heritage doesn't determine opportunity, challenges deeply held beliefs on all sides. I know, she admitted, but we must start somewhere, mustn't we? The plural pronoun hung between them, neither acknowledged nor rejected. Nakohe studied her face for a long moment, as though memorizing features that might have changed during their separation. "You've traveled a greater distance than miles since leaving Philadelphia," he finally said. "We both have journeys that can't be measured on maps," she replied quietly. A call from the driver interrupted their conversation. Dinner was prepared, and passengers were gathering around the fire. With reluctance, Winnie turned away. "I should join the others." Nakohe nodded understanding. "I'll take first watch tonight," he said, resuming his professional demeanor as they returned to the camp, where curious eyes observed their interaction with varying degrees of subtlety. That night, wrapped in blankets against the cooling air, Winnie lay awake long after other passengers had succumbed to travel exhaustion. She watched Nakohe's silhouette against the stars as he patrolled the camp's perimeter, a solitary guardian whose careful movements spoke of heightened awareness, even in apparent solitude. Tomorrow, they would reach Fort Sill. Tomorrow, reality would replace anticipation, bringing whatever challenges and possibilities awaited them there. Tomorrow, the distance between ideals and implementation would become apparent, requiring adjustments to dreams cultivated during months of separation. Yet despite these uncertainties, Winnie felt a profound sense of rightness about the path she had chosen. Whether her school succeeded by official standards or failed according to bureaucratic metrics, she had followed truth rather than convention. She had transformed abandonment into opportunity, prejudice into purpose. Whatever happened next would build upon that foundation rather than erode it. With that knowledge settling like a blessing around her shoulders, Winnie finally drifted toward sleep, her dreams filled with classrooms where children of all backgrounds gathered around shared knowledge, their differences enriching rather than dividing their common humanity. Fort Sill emerged from the Oklahoma landscape like a vision of order imposed upon wilderness. Whitewashed buildings arranged in military precision, the American flag snapping in the wind above the commanding officers' headquarters. As the stagecoach rolled through the gates, Winnie noted differences from Fort Kearny immediately. Here, the boundaries between military and civilian populations seemed more permeable, with native women moving openly through the parade ground, and children of various backgrounds playing together near the sutler's store. Nakohe rode ahead to announce their arrival, returning shortly with a welcoming party that included Major Harrison, the fort's second-in-command, and his wife Eleanor, a tall woman with intelligent eyes and a warmth that seemed genuine rather than performative. "Mrs. Aldridge," Eleanor Harrison greeted her, stepping forward as Winnie descended from the coach. "We're delighted you've arrived safely. Your journey must have been exhausting." "It had its challenges," Winnie acknowledged, accepting the woman's outstretched hands, "but the final leg benefited from excellent guidance." She glanced toward Nakohe, who maintained a professional distance, despite having ridden beside their coach for the past day and a half. "Indeed," Major Harrison agreed, following her gaze. "Scout Nakohe's knowledge of the territory is unmatched. We're fortunate to have him at Fort Sill." The casual compliment, delivered without the grudging tone such acknowledgments often carried at Fort Kearny, suggested a different atmosphere prevailed here. "We've prepared quarters for you in the visiting officers section," Eleanor continued, linking her arm through Winnie's with familiar ease. "Nothing luxurious, I'm afraid, but comfortable enough until more permanent arrangements can be made for your school." As they walked toward the residential area, Eleanor proved a font of practical information. "Colonel Richards has allocated the old quartermaster's building for your classrooms. It needs work, certainly, but has ample space. Several families have already expressed interest in enrollment, mostly mixed heritage children, and some from the Comanche reservation, though a few military families have inquired as well. The news surprised and encouraged Winnie. I hadn't expected such immediate interest. Eleanor's smile held a hint of conspiracy. Word of your arrival has circulated for weeks, especially after Scout Nakohe's reports about your background and educational approach became known to certain sympathetic ears. The implication was clear. Nakohe had been advocating for her school in her absence, preparing the ground for her arrival through carefully placed information. Winnie's heart warmed at this evidence of his support, though her expression revealed nothing beyond polite appreciation. I'm grateful for any assistance. Establishing a new school requires community backing to succeed, which you'll have, though not universally, Eleanor cautioned as they approached a modest but well-maintained structure. Some traditionalists on both sides remain skeptical. Education that crosses conventional boundaries threatens established hierarchies, as I'm sure you're aware. The frank assessment confirmed Winnie's impression of Eleanor Harrison as a potential ally. I've encountered similar resistance before, though in different contexts. I imagine you have, Eleanor replied with knowing emphasis. She paused at the entrance to what would be Winnie's temporary quarters. Rest today. Tomorrow we'll show you the school building and introduce you to some of the families who've expressed interest in your program. After Eleanor departed, Winnie explored her new accommodations. 2 small rooms, simply furnished but scrupulously clean, with windows overlooking the eastern edge of the fort, where prairies stretched toward distant hills. The space felt like a threshold between her past and whatever future awaited, temporary by design, yet significant in what it represented. She unpacked her few possessions, arranging books on the narrow shelf beside the bed and placing the wooden box containing Nakohe's letters in the small desk drawer. The silver bear brooch and compass rose pendant she laid carefully on the dresser, twin symbols of the journey that had brought her here. A soft knock interrupted her arrangements. Opening the door, she found a young Comanche woman holding a covered tray, her expression reserved but not unfriendly. Miss Aldridge, I brought food. Major Harrison's wife said you might be hungry after traveling. That's very kind. Please come in, miss. Morning Star, the woman supplied, entering with graceful efficiency. She set the tray on the small table by the window, then hesitated, clearly wanting to say more but uncertain how to proceed. Was there something else, Morning Star? Winnie prompted gently. The young woman straightened, meeting Winnie's gaze directly. My brother is 12. He wants to learn reading and numbers, but the reservation school teaches only farming to boys and sewing to girls. Would your school be different? The direct question, the first real test of Winnie's educational philosophy in this new context, deserved equally direct response. Yes. My school will teach all subjects to all students according to their abilities and interests, not their gender or background. Morningstar nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. Nakohe said you would say this, but I wanted to hear it myself. Without further explanation, she departed, leaving Winnie to contemplate this first tangible evidence that her arrival had sparked hope among those whose educational options had previously been limited by rigid classifications. The following days passed in a blur of introductions and preparations. Eleanor Harrison proved an invaluable guide, accompanying Winnie to meetings with potential students' families and helping navigate the complex social hierarchies of a frontier. Fort where military protocol intersected with tribal customs and civilian practicalities. The designated school building, as Eleanor had warned, required substantial work. Years as a storage facility had left it dusty and disorganized, though its basic structure remained sound. Winnie spent hours each day cleaning, arranging, and, transforming the space into something that might welcome children of diverse backgrounds to a shared educational experience. To her surprise, volunteers appeared to assist, soldiers assigned by Colonel Richards, women from both military families and nearby settlements, even a few tribal elders curious about this unusual venture. Most significant was the quiet presence of Morning Star, who arrived daily with her younger brother Eaglewing to help prepare the schoolroom. Her grandfather was a storyteller before the reservations, Morning Star explained, as they arranged benches in a semicircle rather than the rigid rows typical of government schools. He believed knowledge should flow like a river, not be contained. In separate pools, your circle reminds me of his teaching lodge. Such unexpected connections between Winnie's educational instincts and indigenous traditions occurred frequently, reinforcing her conviction that learning transcended cultural boundaries when approached with genuine respect for diverse perspectives. Through these busy days, she saw Nakohe only occasionally and always at a distance. His duties frequently took him away from the fort, tracking movement of various tribal groups or guiding military patrols through unfamiliar territory. Even when present, he maintained professional separation that others might interpret as proper distance between a military scout and a respectable educator. Yet Winnie felt his influence everywhere, in the unusual support from Colonel Richards, in the ready assistance from certain sergeants who mentioned casually that the scout thought you might need help with those shelves, ma'am, in the arrival of books from unlikely sources when she mentioned specific educational needs. 2 weeks after her arrival, as twilight softened the harsh angles of military architecture, Winnie walked along the edge of the parade ground, seeking fresh air after a day spent organizing donated supplies. Lost in thought about the coming school term, she nearly missed the figure who emerged from shadows near the stables. "You should have an escort this late," Nakohe observed quietly, falling into step beside her. "The fort is safer than most places, but not entirely without risk." "I needed to think," she replied simply. "Sometimes movement helps clarify thoughts." He nodded, understanding. "Walk with me then. There's something I'd like to show you." Curious, Winnie followed as he led her away from the main buildings toward a small rise beyond the eastern perimeter. Army regulations typically prohibited civilians from venturing outside fort boundaries after dark, but the sentry merely nodded as Nakohe signed something to him, apparently granting special permission. They walked in companionable silence until reaching the crest of the gentle hill. There, Nakohe stopped, gesturing toward the darkening landscape that spread before them like an artist's canvas painted in twilight hues. "This is what I wanted you to see," he said softly, "the territory as it exists between day and night, belonging fully to neither yet incorporating elements of both." Winnie understood immediately the metaphor he offered, a visual representation of the space they both inhabited, between worlds defined by rigid categories, yet transcending such artificial divisions. "It's beautiful," she said simply. "It is," he agreed. "I come here when decisions weigh heavily, when I need perspective beyond what the fort provides." Something in his tone suggested particular significance to this confession. "You've been making important decisions recently?" she asked carefully. Nakohe turned toward her, his expression more open than she had seen since their days in the cave. "Colonel Richards has offered me a new position, liaison between the fort and reservation communities, with particular emphasis on educational initiatives." Understanding dawned gradually. "A position connected to my school?" "Adjacent to it," he clarified. "Independent but complementary. I would help identify students who might benefit from your program, explain its purpose to families hesitant about military-affiliated education, and ensure tribal perspectives are respected rather than suppressed." The possibilities inherent in such an arrangement professional collaboration that would allow them to work together openly without the constraints imposed by conventional relationships, expanded before her like the landscape spreading beneath the hill. "You've accepted?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've considered it carefully," he replied, his gaze steady on hers. "Such a role would represent significant change from my current duties. Less scouting, more diplomacy. Some would view it as abandoning traditional skills for uncomfortable compromise. And what do you think?" He was silent for a moment, his profile strong against the deepening twilight. "I think there are many ways to honor one's heritage. Sometimes the most faithful path lies not in preserving old divisions, but in building bridges others thought impossible." The words echoed Winnie's own reflections about education's potential to transcend artificial boundaries. That Nakohe had reached similar conclusions through his separate journey suggested a harmony of purpose that transcended their personal connection, though it certainly encompassed it. "Then we would be colleagues of sorts," she observed, testing the concept aloud. "Of sorts," he agreed, a smile touching his lips. "Though I suspect Fort Sill would still consider certain associations between us inappropriate." "Fort Sill doesn't dictate my associations," Winnie replied with quiet firmness. "Not anymore." She touched the silver bear brooch at her collar, then the compass rose beside it. "I've learned to navigate by different stars than conventional propriety." Nakohe's expression softened as he recognized both pieces, the symbol of his name and the traveler's blessing Eulalia had described in her letters. "Two guides," he observed, "one from the past, one pointing toward the future. Both meaningful," she acknowledged. "Both true." He reached out slowly, giving her ample opportunity to withdraw if she wished. When she remained still, he gently touched the compass rose pendant, his fingers brushing against her skin with deliberate care. "I've accepted the position," he said simply. "Whatever comes of it, success or failure, acceptance or rejection, it represents a choice made freely rather than a role assigned by others' expectations." The declaration held significance beyond its literal meaning, an acknowledgement that their paths, so unexpectedly intersected during a Nebraska blizzard, now aligned by mutual choice rather than circumstance. Whatever relationship might develop between them would evolve naturally, without predetermined boundaries or externally imposed limitations. "Then we begin together," Winnie said softly, "each with our own purpose but sharing common ground." "Common ground," he repeated, glancing at the earth beneath their feet. "Territory claimed by governments, traversed by tribes, and now inhabited by two people seeking to create something new from elements of both worlds. An appropriate foundation. As darkness settled around them, they stood silent beneath emerging stars, neither rushing toward declarations nor retreating into conventional distance. The moment held its own significance, a threshold crossed, a possibility acknowledged, a future glimpsed but not presumed. Eventually, Nakohe offered his arm with formal courtesy that somehow transcended the gesture's conventional meaning. "We should return before the century changes shift." Winnie placed her hand on his arm, the contact simple yet profound in its public acknowledgement of private connection. "Yes," she agreed, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. "We have much to prepare before classes begin." They walked back toward Fort Sill's lamplight, two figures moving in perfect step despite different origins, their shadows merging into a single silhouette against the Oklahoma plain. Behind them, wind stirred prairie grasses in rhythms ancient as the land itself. Ahead, a schoolhouse waited to be filled with children whose education might blur boundaries long considered immutable. Between these realities, past traditions and future possibilities, Winnie and Nakohe found their present moment creating a path neither could have envisioned when winter's fury had threatened one life and sent another to its rescue. What began in ice had transformed through fire, emerging as something neither fully Comanche nor completely European, but uniquely their own. A shared language of understanding no blizzard could extinguish and no prejudice could deny. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.